what are you most alarmed about in Suella Braverman's speech?
Well, I'm alarmed at the choice of language. I'm alarmed that she's a government minister who obviously will have had this speech signed off by the Prime Minister as being at least to some degree reflecting of a government position, because that's what happens when ministers go and do speeches. They can't just
fair enough. I get that.
Make it tough. So I'm worried that this reflects a wider government position, and I'm worried that it reflects a really dangerous bigotry towards certain groups, including, in particular, members of the LGBTQ community.
Well, hang on a second, Ava. In what way do you think she was bigoted towards the LGBTQ community in that speech?
I think it's clearly bigoted to present LGBTQ people as she did, as though they weren't genuinely in need of support and help and safety from the UK when they're escaping from countries where just being themselves, just loving who they love, is criminalized, sometimes can result in them being seriously harmed, tortured, or even killed. She said that people in those circumstances shouldn't be granted asylum in the UK. She said that...
Yeah, to be fair, Ava, I'm taking your point. I know what you mean, and I accept that. But to be fair, you know, she didn't say that. She said being gay cannot surely be a qualification for being allowed to live in Britain, for getting asylum in Britain. That's what she said.
And luckily for all of us, it isn't. Being gay on its own isn't qualification.
Well, that's what she said. She's basically said
she said it shouldn't be. And this is what I want to really say about this, is that her entire speech was a lie, because she said that being gay shouldn't be enough to get you refugee protection in the UK. It isn't. You have to also prove that
you have a well-founded fear
of persecution.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, exactly. I mean, being gay cannot be a qualification for asylum in Britain. But if you're being persecuted, I don't think she's ruling out that if you're gay and you are definitely being persecuted, you won't have a case for asylum. I don't think she's ruling that out.
Well, then she's not proposing any change at all, is she? Because the current situation is that you have to prove that you are being persecuted as a gay person in order to obtain asylum in the UK. And this goes to my wider point, which is that this speech wasn't really about the reality of what it's right to do to protect refugees and what would be right for our communities in the UK in the face of a future where people will always have to move in order to find protection. This speech was about Suella Braverman and Suella Braverman's career, and Suella Braverman positioning herself by going to allies on the hard right in the United States as somebody who she hopes will be in a position to take over leadership of the Tory party in the future and drive it further towards this dangerous agenda of closing ourselves off to protecting people who most people in the UK agree actually are fully deserving of protection.
Fair enough. Now, what about her reservations, shall we say? You've got to admit that the constituents of this situation do look somewhat dubious, that the way we treat refugees is dictated by the United Nations Convention on Refugees, which was written in 1951, specifically in the slipstream of World War II to help 2 million refugees made homeless by that conflict. So it's a very old convention. And she's saying that actually, if you look at the terms of that convention, and indeed the European Convention on Human Rights, it means that around the world, should they all want to come to Britain, 780 million people could qualify for asylum here. We need to look at those rules, don't we? That's far too many.
Well, I'm afraid I'm only able to respond to what we actually face in reality and not the fantasy land that our Home Secretary seems to inhabit. It's actually quite evidently the case that it takes quite extreme circumstances for a person to choose to leave their home and to escape to find safety elsewhere. And in the vast majority of cases, when somebody leaves their home because of danger, they don't even leave their country. They just move to somewhere else where they can go into hiding or escape the immediate danger. And then if they do cross a border, in the vast majority of cases, it's the countries that neighbor the one where they have fled that are shouldering the vast majority of responsibility for people who are moving. So in reality, the UK receives a tiny trickle of the amount of people who are displaced and who are needing safety worldwide. And the reality is that that's not going to change. And Suella Braverman can go and burnish her right-wing credentials and make her big speeches in Washington. But the reality is that there will always be people who will need to move to find safety. And the UK will be one of the destinations for that. So what we should be doing is having a serious conversation about how do we plan for that? How do we make sure none of our communities end up in a situation where we're not in a position to help people because we are so stretched ourselves? Because this government has cut on our public services for decades, has cut down so that all of us are struggling. And now we are in a situation where it's genuinely hard for some communities to be asked to take in newcomers. But actually,
well,
we need
yeah,
to
that's
plan
because the
where
country
we
is
can
full. That's
take in
because, Ava, the country is full. There's 70 million of us here. We don't have the infrastructure for all of this.